City in the Sea, Part 3. Chapter 17. The Houses. They dined at 6 o'clock, and after dinner they sat on deck in the gathering dark, making plans for the morrow. The map of Hylos, which they had studied so often, was impressed on their minds, so that they had no need to refer to it. Roughly, and for their purpose, the town of Hylos might be described as framed around 3 streets and the marketplace, or agora. The theatre, presumably outside the walls, did not come into the plan of the town. The 3 streets, as named by Isaac Berens, were the Street of the Winged Victory running north, the Street of the Winds running east, and the Street of Hermes running south. The town was roughly half-moon-shaped, the curve to the east. Berens, who must have carried a photographic camera in his brain, had drawn his map with the most loving minuteness, showing all sorts of little by-streets intersecting the main avenues. Amongst the notes on the back of the map was one which read, "Search mainly houses adjoining Agora End Victory, Hermes, Saint of Winds." That evidently referred to treasure. It was obvious enough that whatever works of art Hylos might disclose would be found in the better-class houses adjoining the big streets. But why did Isaac specify the Agora end of the streets? What antiquarian or art lover instinct prompted him? Who could tell? "Tomorrow," said Sam, "I'll bring the ship along, and we'll anchor right over one of those houses. The drift is nothing. I won't use the anchor. Just a couple of ballast pigs at the end of the cable will hold her steady, and we can work the air pump from deck. She has a low freeboard, and will be just as handy to use as the boat, and a lot more comfortable." "Glastonbury knows what to look for," said Bobby. "I've given him a course of instruction. Pretty simple, too. Everything movable he can lay hands on, and especially anything in the way of figures or heads made of stone. There's no use in talking of objects of art to Glastonbury, but he understands the meaning of figures." "It's nothing of a job as far as he's concerned," said Sam. "It's only a 6 or 7 fathom drop into one of those courtyards, and the Sulu pearl divers will do 17 fathoms without a diving dress." "Tell me," said Marcia. "I only know about diving that the diver has an air pipe to give him air which has to be pumped to him. Well, suppose we lower Glastonbury down into one of those courtyards." "We don't lower him," said Sam. "He goes down himself." "Well, he's in the courtyard, then he goes under the colonnade and into the room of the house. Isn't there danger of the air pipe getting tangled round something, or bent, so's he can't breathe?" "Not with a diver who knows his work," replied the other. "Those houses are nothing to Glastonbury. Why, he's often gone down to a sunk ship and into it, into the cabins and places, and that off the English coast, where the water's as thick as pea soup compared with the water here. How will he see when he gets into the house?" "Oh, he's got an electric torch. We lower a net bag with a sinker in it. I've got 2 in the sail room. He puts what he finds in the bag and we haul it up, so he hasn't to come to the surface every time he finds anything." "And how does he come up when he's finished? Do we pull him?" "No, he comes up a rope. Or if he's in a hurry, he just shuts the escape valve in his helmet and the air balloons out his dress, and he rises like a bubble." Marcia sat for a moment in silence. The moon was just lifting, a great silver moon lighting the bay and the sea beyond, silver-faced yet rosy-fingered, for where she touched the bunt of a badly stowed sail and the white planking of the deck, the light showed in it a tinge of rose. "There's one thing I haven't thought of till now," said she. "Are we doing right in keeping this place a secret from the world?" "How do you mean?" said Bobby. "I mean, this is one of the wonders of the world, like Pompeii. It is a Pompeii covered with water instead of lava. Well, oughtn't we to talk about it?" "Why?" asked Bobby. "So that people may see it, archaeologists and people." "I don't see why we should make ourselves advertising agents for this place," said Sam. "Anyhow, I don't see there's any ought in it. You've come out here to scrape up statues and things for old Berens, and from what you say the Greek government might lay claim to them if they knew. No, keep it dark. Suppose you did tell. Even if the Greeks didn't make trouble, what good would it do? You'd have shiploads of beastly tourists coming here, that would be all, and fusty old archaeologists. The world wouldn't be a bit better for it. Anyhow, said Bobby, it's always up to us to give information about the place. We could do it in a year or so, anonymously. Write a letter to the Times or something of that sort. They sat whilst the moon rose higher, lighting the island, the bay and the reefs. The girl trying to fancy shiploads of tourists breaking into this beautiful desolation. Tourists come to do Hyalos. Her mind refused the idea. The city that time had hidden so carefully appealed against it. Take what you will of my treasures, it said, but spare me that. They were up an hour after sunrise next morning, and after tea and biscuits served on deck by Bowler, they started to get the anchor up and the auxiliary engine going. It was good to be alive. A tepid, sea-scented breeze ruffled the bay and brought a faint whisper from the reef, where the foam traces showed in lines of gold. Gulls filled the air and followed them as the Lorna, with the anchor up and the engine going, turned to the helm and glided eastward, whilst the hands forward were getting ready the ballast pigs to serve as anchors, and Glastonbury, on his knees, was going over the diving gear which he had spread out on deck. The great brass helmet, the lead sinkers, the boots so heavy that they were difficult to lift, the air tube and signal line, the electric torch, all and each of these he was inspecting with the care of a man whose life depended on perfection of detail. The pump had been rigged on the starboard side, and having finished with the gear, he turned to the pump, overhauling it, while Sam, forward and leaning over the side, was giving directions to the steersman. They passed over the theatre, then the marketplace showed its wide surface glimmering up through the breezed water. Sam ordered the engine to be shut off, and the Lorna, gliding with the way on her, stole towards the advancing houses, whose walls showed now like a submarine cloud, now more solidly. "Ready with the anchor there," cried Sam. Marcia, standing by the steersman, watched breathlessly, whilst the fellows handling the two great ballast pigs attached to the cable got ready to heave them over. Then came the voice. "Port. Steady. So." And a moment later, "Damn, we've overrun it. Put her back a stroke or two." The little propeller flopped and was still. The Lorna receded slightly, ceased to move, and then began gently to drift. "Over with the anchor!" The order came sharp as a pistol shot, and on the splash Marcia came forward and looked down. Sam had manoeuvred the Lorna right over the courtyard of a house on whose tessellated pavement the ballast pigs were resting. 7.5 fathoms of cable were out, and the bubbles were still coming up. "Will she hold?" asked Glastonbury, who was leaning over beside Sam. "Sure," said Sam, "but let her swing first. That weight will hold her with this move of current, but we'll soon see." The Lorna was shifting her position, coming round gently bow onto the almost imperceptible drift. Then she hung motionless to the tautened cable. "She holds all right," said Sam. "But, if you like, I'll put another anchor out." "No, I reckon that's enough," said the diver. "If she did drift, them pigs would catch up against the roof there." He pointed to the roof of the colonnade. "House, you call it? Why, it's more like a darned cistern without a lid." "Well, that's how they built in the old days," replied the other. "And now you'll remember all I told you. Under that roof place, you'll find the rooms. Take your time over it and don't be in a hurry. Nab anything you can find and fix in your head all the details." Glastonbury turned from the side, and then, indifferently, as though he were going down in Poole Harbour to free an anchor chain or fix a pile, he began to dress. Marcia watched. It was the most exciting moment of her life. What might happen to him? What might he not find? No treasure hunt could have more thrills in it than this search, not for base gold, but for that which no gold could create. This was the moment of moments towards which all their labours had tended. She watched him getting into the canvas suit, and the boots weighing 16 pounds each being put on his feet, and the lead sinkers on his shoulders, the great helmet with the front glass open, put on his head and fixed, with the air tube attached. Church and Bowler were at the pump, and they set it going. "Right," said Glastonbury, and the helmet was closed to a hiss of air from the escape valve. Then she watched as slowly, with the movements of a paralyzed elephant, he turned to the side, got over, and began to crawl down the ladder. Oh, if anything should happen to the pump, to the air tube! She had never seen a diver going down before, and the thought clutched her so that for a moment she did not dare to look. When she did, leaning over beside Bobby, she saw on the tessellated pavement beneath her the diver like a horned monster, a long stream of bubbles ascending from his head. He was standing erect and seemed looking round him. Then, followed by the pipe and the signal line, he vanished beneath the colonnade roof. The clanking of the pump, slow and rhythmical, filled the air, answering to the voices of the far-off gulls. "Now over with the net," said Sam, and the net bag with its sinker went down, resting on the courtyard floor. As it did so, a fish, blue and grey, and big as a 20-pound salmon, darted from the shadows where the diver had vanished. He had frightened it out, and it fled hither and thither, scared by the ship above, and disappearing at last under the colonnade roof at the northern end. A minute passed, 2, 3, 4. Then the figure in the helmet, the air bubbles gaily spraying upwards from it, reappeared. He was carrying something. He bent by the net bag, then rose and passed off again into the shadows. Bobby and Sam between them hauled up the bag, dripping from the sea. A Greek vase showed through the meshes of the bag, a vase of red-glazed earthenware, exquisite in shape and pictured in black with men reclining at a banquet and girl flute players playing double flutes. It stood nearly 18 inches in height in the light of the sun that it had not seen for 2,000 years, and Marcia, kneeling before it, could not speak. She lifted it in both her hands to pour the water from it, when out tumbled a little figure that seemed made of crystal, a winged Eros, fat as a Roman Cupid, standing on its hands on a base of crystal, its feet in the air, turning a somersault. Some child's toy, possibly, dropped into the jar by the child or by its mother for safe keeping. Bowler, who had turned his head for a moment as he worked at the pump, saw this thing as it stood on the deck where Marcia had placed it beside the jar, and laughed, a single laugh like a knock on a board. Then, without a word, he went on with his pumping. The humour of the thing had kept through all the centuries, and the artist had not worked in vain. Meanwhile, Sam had flung the net over again, but it did not come up again immediately. Glastonbury, going and coming, was collecting things in a dump to save time. Then they began to come up so rapidly that the receivers had only time to disengage them from the bag. Vases like the first, shallow drinking cups, all exquisite in form, unbroken and pictured with feasts, battles, and ceremonies, flute girls and girls at play, men sacrificing animals on altars, and men putting on armor for the fight. A bracelet of metal, heavy as gold, a cup of black metal, possibly silver, and carved with figures. A sea nymph of marble, astride a marble dolphin, the whole not over 10 inches high. And a disc thrower in marble, like the discobolus of the museum, except in size, for the plinth was not bigger than a soup plate. All these things the collector of antiques, 7 fathoms below the keel, sent up to be received dripping from the sea, and all these things, to the value of thousands of pounds, stood on the deck planking in the burning sun, of little interest to any but Marcia and Bobby. Sam had talked of a crew of blind men. In reality, he was nearly as blind as his crew, as far as these things were concerned. Then Glastonbury came up, reporting a clean sweep. With helmet off and cigarette in his lips, he gave a sketch of the rooms he had entered. "More like cells in a police station than decent rooms," said Glastonbury. "All but the big room I got them things from," pointing to the statuary. It seemed that the largest of the jars had come from the big room, and the rest from a room that might have been a kitchen. There were stone benches, but no trace of any wooden furniture. That would no doubt have been eaten by the sea ages ago. Well, there on the deck was the result of the sacking of a single house, and if all the other houses in the better-class streets of Hyalos were to give up an equal amount of treasure, it seemed to Sam that they would want the Mauretania to bring the stuff back to England. He said so. The remark did not trouble Marcia. Her mind was already in trouble. They had clean forgotten packing material. Her woman's instinct for crockery had brought this fact suddenly into her mind. Those lovely jars, which she would not have allowed a servant to handle. How were they to be carried unbroken to England? The statuary was all right. It would stand rough usage, but the jars. Where was the straw, and where were the hampers that ought to have been provided? She asked all this kneeling on the deck beside her treasures. "We can shove them in the sail room," said Sam. "Put them close enough together, and they won't carry away." "Shove them in the sail room? Don't you know that each one ought to be wrapped round with straw, and then straw put between them? It is my fault. I ought to have thought of this. But then how was I to know? I never imagined finding things so fragile as these." "Beg your pardon, miss, but you were talking about straw," said Bowler. "Yes." "Well, there's enough grass growing ashore to make all the straw you want. It's all there bar the cutting." "We've nothing to cut it with," said Bobby. "There are knives enough, and we can sharpen them," replied Sam. "We'll start in tomorrow, and when we've cut enough, we'll leave it to dry in the sun. Meanwhile, you can stow those things in the sail room. There's no roll or pitch here to harm them." They went below to get some food, and 2 hours later, the anchor being got in, Sam jockeyed the Lorna over the courtyard of the next house. Glastonbury was down 5 minutes. He sent nothing up. He came up himself with the report that the place was stripped. Stone couches, a chair of marble too heavy to be moved, and a few scraps of corroded metal were all the things he found. A depressing result after the first glorious discoveries. The inhabitants had either removed their things or had cared nothing for objects of art and adornment. It was Sam who cheered the others up as they sat in the cabin that night discussing matters. "There's no use in thinking on a job like this," said Sam. "We've begun well anyhow. I don't care whether these hyalites cleared out before the sea took them or were swallowed whole. It stands to reason that one house can't be full of things and all the rest empty. We've just got to go ahead and go slow and methodical, and tomorrow there'll be no diving. We'll land and cut grass and pray for fine weather."
Chapter 18.
A terrible danger. Next day, whilst the hands were cutting grass, Bobby, who had come on shore with them and who was not wanted for the work, started on an expedition of his own. Hyalos, from far at sea, to the west looks like a single rock washed by the waves. Closer, and to the north you can see a high down by the peak, and the beach seems just a strip of foreshore, but when you land, it is different. The beach is broad, and the high lands are broken, showing two canyons on this, the northern side. You can in fact cross the island from north to south by taking either of these canyons which run east and west of the main peak. Lestrange, having helped to pull the boat up, and whilst the hands were getting to work, took his seat on a rock for a moment to look at the view. The island looked nothing from the sea, but the sea seen from the island was a vision of pure enchantment. It is like that amongst the Greek islands. One world when you are on board ship, another world when you land. The sea brimming into the beach, the diamond-clear green-blue sea, showed scarcely a ruffle. Smooth as a satin sheet, underblown by a gentle wind it raised, and let fall the Lorna mirroring her, and passing on to break on the beach in foot-high waves. Then, from the cliff foot and from the canyons cutting inland, a faint fragrance filled the air, the warm smell of lavender and thyme and all sorts of low-growing herbs trodden on by the sun, a bouquet sweet as that of the Corsican maqui, the incense of 100 humble plants that in some subtle way brought back the past. It was strange to think that when Hyalos was a town standing in the sunlight and not in the sea, those plants were as fragrant as today, the thyme just as curious in its speech, and the wild lavender just as sweet. Strange were they not denizens of a world where flesh is more enduring than the Alps, and the daisy a million years older than the pyramid, and where a song may outlive a people and a story a civilization. Here on the north beach of Hyalos, or over at Naxos, or Milo, if you get by yourself with no companions but the sun and blue sea, and the sky above, and the perfume of the shore, a trireme coming in with the black-bearded rowers keeping time to a flute, would be perfectly in the picture. Nothing has altered since the change in the land level that has submerged a city, and the attrition that has made the peak a shade less high than the peak observed by the Argo or the wool ships of Amorgos. Leaving the beach and the grass cutters at their work, Lestrange came up the easternmost canyon, treading the sweet herbs underfoot and avoiding the vast rocks that the course of ages had tumbled from the peak and higher lands. A turn of the valley brought him to a place where it widened out and spread into a vast down like the downlands above Freshwater in the Isle of Wight. It was steep climbing, yet easy compared with the stair-steep canyon, and worth the trouble, for here on the shoulder, when he reached it, he found himself in a new world, a world of silence and high, clear air, where the turf and thyme bushes spread to the edge of the southern cliffs, and beyond the cliff edge, the southern sea sailless to the remote and sharp-cut sea line. The down sweep had only one break in it, a broad and cup-like hollow where, sheltered from the sea winds, grew a few distorted trees. Near the trees something was moving, a wild goat cropping the herbage. He sat down amidst the thyme to rest and smoke a pipe. It was delightful, just as if a door had been closed, shutting out the ship and Sam and the voyage, and the hunt after hidden treasure, ambition, the past, everything he had ever known, even Marcia. That was the strange thing. He never once thought of her. In this feeling of release that had come upon him, there was no place for the past. The cry of a bird from far above made him turn as he lay on his elbow and look up. An eagle that had left its eyrie on the peak was wheeling in the blue. It passed away, and he turned again on his side, watching the goat that had left the zone of the trees and was browsing now on the grass beyond. Something lying on the turf in the center of the depression caught his eye. It looked at first like a small tree trunk, ash-colored and fluted. Then he saw that it was part of a broken pillar. Some old temple had once been there, no doubt, of which it was the sole remains. The warmth of the sun had brought out more than the perfume of the herbage. The tiny song of innumerable insects filled the air. He only noticed it now when resting and close to the earth. Occasionally the chanting of gulls came from the southern cliffs, sounds that had ringed and filled this place for ages and ages, sharing today in the terrible antiquity of the grass, of the thyme bushes and the hidden wild hyacinth bulbs that later would flower in the face of spring with a shameless pretense of newness. He was, perhaps, the first man to visit that spot since— when? The reef-strewn sea that guarded Hyalos alone could tell, and one might have fancied that all those vague scents and tiny sounds of nature so long unsampled by man had gained potency by reason of man's abstention from them. They were of the essence and nature of slumber, a drug in the air that gathered force till presently, turning from his side to his back, and with his hat over his eyes, he fell asleep. He was awakened by a hand on his shoulder. Someone was shaking him and calling on him to wake up. It was Sam. Sam had seen him go up the canyon and had come to look for him and fetch him. It was dinner time. He must have been asleep for hours. "Wake up, you old fool," said Sam. "Going to sleep in the sun like that." The sleeper roused himself, propped himself on his elbow and stared at the other. Then he yawned, rubbed his eyes and sat up. Sam had wakened him from a most delightful dream. He could not remember a single detail of it, yet the aftertaste was heavenly. It seemed to him that he had been with a number of people who had been leading him to some place more beautiful than earth, that he had almost clasped an impossible happiness, the rays of which still clung to him. "Here's your pipe and hat," said Sam. "I found them away over there. What you want fooling about and going to sleep in the sun without a hat for?" Bobby, fully awake now, saw that he was not in the place where he had fallen asleep. He must have got up in his sleep and crossed the depression in the ground and lain down again here, led, perhaps, by those delightful people of his dream. It was well that they had led him no further, for the cliff edge was only a few yards away. "I must have been doing a sleepwalk," said Bobby, quite unconcerned. "Sit down a moment. There's no hurry. What you say?" "Rot. There was no danger. It's not the first time I've done it." "I know," said Sam, who remembered this peculiarity of the other in Oxford days, "but it's been darned near the last time. This stuff is slippery, and you stop just where it begins to shelve. Get up, you old fool, and come on. I want my dinner." He got him up at last, and they recrossed the hollow and got back to the beach, where the men who had knocked off work for dinner were seated about with the grass they had cut that morning, lying in a pile near the boat landing place. After dinner, this stuff had to be dealt with. It would have been easy enough to get it into the boat in armfuls, but the real problem was how to get it from the boat on the Lorna. It would have to be lifted. They solved the problem by making it into bundles. This took time. It took them till 4 o'clock, when by common consent they knocked off work for the day. It was curious how this alien business had tired the hands and put them out of temper. Even Bowler, the proposer of it, was short in manner, and Sam was not too sweet about it. The skipper of the Lorna, though he had fallen in with Bowler's suggestion, before the accomplished fact resented his ship being turned into a hay barge. That the hay was to be used to pack antiques, not to feed horses, was a fact that made no difference to him. He objected to the hay. Sailors are queer things, especially small yacht sailors, and at supper, when the question was touched on, he refused to take it as a joke. "I'm sure I don't know what is wrong with the place," said Marcia. "You're all come back in such a bad temper, all except you," she finished, turning to Bobby. "No reason to," said Sam. "He's had the whole morning off snoozing on top of that blessed Downs." "It was such a relief to get rid of you," replied the other. "It's a wonder I didn't stick there." "You'd have stuck there right enough," grumbled Sam, "if you'd tumbled over that cliff." Then, lighting his pipe, off he went on deck, leaving the others to finish their meal. "What cliff?" asked Marcia. "Oh, Sam's an idiot," replied Bobby. "There wasn't any danger. I climbed up to the top there and went to sleep on the grass, and I must have got up and walked a bit in my sleep. I've done it before, and I expect it was finding myself on land and able to use my legs that made me do it. You must come up there tomorrow and see that place. It's just like the Sussex Downs when you get there." "The Sussex Downs?" "Yes, you'd never believe it from here. The land goes rolling away to the cliffs on the south side, and there are wild goats, and there's a temple." "A temple?" Bobby paused for a moment. "No. What was I saying? A temple. There's just a bit of an old pillar lying on the ground. I remember now. I dreamt something about a temple being there. I suppose it was the sight of that pillar started the idea in my mind. I had a most awfully jolly dream. I can't remember a bit of it except that temple which has just cropped up in my mind." He paused and fell into a frowning reverie, as though trying to recapture other parts of that jolly dream and failing. "No, it's gone. Clean." "Maybe," said Marcia. "You saw what once had been there." "How do you mean?" "Oh, I don't know. Things leave photographs of themselves. At least I believe they do. I was told some time ago by a person who said the story was absolutely true, that an old farmer was coming home one night over the downs somewhere on the south coast, where there had been a Roman camp. When he got home, he said he had seen the funniest sight on the way, a race between a lot of milk carts." "Milk carts?" "That's what he said. What he did see without any doubt was a chariot race." "A chariot race? What else could it have been? A Roman chariot would at once recall a milk cart to a farmer's mind." "But surely," said Bobby, "you don't believe that nonsense?" "Why not? We know very little about this world and its possibilities, and now, if you have done, I'll clear up. Yes, I'll go and see that place with you tomorrow. I'd love to." Chapter 19. One of the delightful people. Next morning broke gorgeous and absolutely windless, the sea like a mirror, and Sam grumbling that they had to put in another day over the grass. Marcia, who never let pleasure stand in front of business, had so much to do on board that she could not get ashore before 10. She had not only to tidy up things and put the cabin to rights, but also to pack food for the working party. Bobby rowed her off, and having beached the boat with the help of Bowler, he led her along to the opening of the canyon he had ascended yesterday. Sam did not bother them. He was on board writing up his log. The air was hot in the canyon. The atmosphere, even out in the Lorna, was many degrees hotter than yesterday. The wind, having withdrawn for the last 24 hours, seemed to have made way for a momentary summer. When they reached the place where the canyon fanned out and the downs lay before them, Marcia paused to rest for a moment. She was tired. Nothing tires one more than sudden change in the temperature like this, especially coming after weeks of invigorating sea breezes. "Sure you're up for the climb?" asked Bobby. "Or would you sooner go back? We can come another day." "No thanks," replied Marcia. "I'm all right." They took the rise at a slant and with intervals for rest, and when they arrived on the shoulder of the down, the girl stood for a moment looking around her. Then she glanced up at the peak. The eagle had left his eyrie and was circling in the blue just as he had circled yesterday. His sharp cry came through the crystal-clear air. Then he passed away and vanished towards the easternmost side of the peak, and the silence resumed itself. The silence which yet held so many sounds, the faint murmur and hum of insects, the vaguest murmur of the sea, less sounds than indications of what might be hidden in the way of sounds in that silence, old as the peak or Hylos itself. "This is the strangest, queerest place," said Marcia, half laughing and turning her head this way and that, as though she were listening or looking for something. "You'd never expect a bit of country like this up here. It's almost English." "Yes, I told you," said Bobby. "It's like the Downs, where the wild bee makes honey, and the thyme is sweet as when the gods of old were young," murmured Marcia. "Yes, it's something like that," said Bobby, who had caught the words. "Makes you feel lonely, doesn't it?" He looked up. The eagle had returned to the sky and was circling above them at a great height. He seemed climbing a spiral staircase in the air, and they sat down to watch him, leaning on their elbows and looking up, till reaching a certain height he struck off seaward and to the northwest. "I wonder where he is going to," said the girl. "If he goes far enough on that course, he'll reach Milo," replied the other. "I expect he's making for there. It's not so very far in a straight line." It was the first time they had been alone together since leaving England, and Bobby, who had always lots to say on board ship, found himself without conversation now. The fact of the matter was he wanted to say a lot of things to Marcia, but couldn't. Much as he was beginning to care for her, the expedition stood first. It was a serious business that had to be finished and done with before personal considerations were to be thought of. He did not know in the least how her feelings stood towards him, and to risk a refusal or a rebuff that might make the position on board impossible was not to be thought of. "Where was the place by the cliffs that you were talking about?" asked Marcia, waking from a moment of reverie during which she seemed to have forgotten the eagle and its destination, and even Bobby. "Which place?" "The place by the cliffs where you went and lay down." "Oh, right over there." He pointed to the grass line where the southern slope began. "I went to sleep somewhere about here, and then I must have got up and walked over there and lain down." "Right by the cliff edge?" "A few yards away." "You might have gone over?" "Oh, there is a Providence who looks after sleepwalkers." "I believe there is," said Marcia. "At least a Providence that protects people from evil and danger. I don't like this place." "High Aloes?" "No. Here. It feels like a room that has been locked up for ever so long. I should think no one ever comes up here, not even fishermen." She paused, and they could hear the faint murmur of insects and the fainter murmur of the sea. The wild goats were not feeding here today. They had moved towards the other side of the peak. Marcia, leaning on her side, listening to the murmuring that filled the warm air, forgot for a moment her dislike for this place. The sense of release from the weariness and distress of life that had touched Bobby yesterday came to her now even more strongly than it had come to him, yet meeting with a stronger opposition. Looking across the hollow where the temple column lay, her eyes were fixed on a far-off gull, just a flake of white on the southern sky, when something in the hollow drew her gaze. The air seemed boiling in the hollow. That was the only way she could express it to herself. Just as the air quivers and shakes over a hot, sandy beach, so the air in the hollow was disturbed. Then suddenly the boiling ceased. The air became normal, but there was something left, a whirling, a residuum, a dream, a reality, a terror, grotesque, obscene, soul-shaking. In the amazement of the moment, she clutched her companion by the arm, clinging to him for 10 or 12 seconds. releasing him for want of power to retain her grip. Then, as quick as they could, rising to their feet, they left that place, saying not one word to each other as they made their way down and back to the beach in a silence understandable, if you have ever seen a fawn. Neither then nor during their afterlife did they ever refer to this terrible matter which formed, yet, a bond between them, the bond of a common danger which they had escaped. Chapter 20. Plans. From that day began the real work of the expedition. Grass-cutting in a burning sun, relieved by the fact that they found a water source from which they could not only drink, but refill the tanks on board, gave place to shifting moorings, exploring house after house of the town, sometimes finding nothing, sometimes jars, drinking cups, small figures of earthenware more or less mutilated, and metal ornaments. In the 15th house they found a marble Hermes with winged feet, so light and delicate that, standing on the deck of the Lorna, he seemed on the point of taking flight towards the sun. Even Bowler and his companions admired this little chap with the sparrow wings on his feet. To Marcia the thought came with a pang that she would have to part with him. All these things, by the contract, were barons, to be turned into money, and long though she had known barons, she well knew that this thing was too valuable to be thought of as a gift. Bad weather had interrupted them for a few days, and it was now over 3 weeks since the morning of Glastonbury's first descent. They had explored the Street of Victory, all but the last 6 houses, that is to say, the part of it that promised treasure, and there remained the Street of the Winds and the Street of Hermes, which they had not even touched. Nor would they touch them. Although they did not speak of breaking off work and going home, they spoke quite definitely on the other point. At least Sam did, the others agreeing. "Glastonbury is showing signs of being used up," said Sam. "And between you and me and the stern post, I don't propose hunting through the rest of this town. Besides, we're pretty full up. Every locker, not to speak of the sail room, is stuffed with jars in straw, and the spare bunks won't hold any more statuary. As it is, you've had to put that discobolus thing in the lazarette. There's the bathroom you can stuff a few things into, and we might put anything that's not breakable in the ballast. There's room here in the cabin, but the bother is, the stuff has to be hidden, for we've got to put into Genoa on the way back, and there's the customs. They haven't got to see any of those things, for the Italians are pretty strict about works of art, and they might think we'd taken them from some Italian island or territory. Anyhow, they'd stop them and make inquiries, and we'd have to say where we pinched them, and then the Greek government would be notified. Only for all that we might take a deck cargo." "But why put into Genoa?" asked Marcia. "Why not go straight home or stop at some French port?" "We've salted Genoa," replied the skipper of the Lorna. "They know us there. They know us as mad English cruising about for fun, and they won't bother to more than come on board and look at the papers and smoke a cigarette, whereas if I put into a French or any other port where we aren't known, the frogs would come on board and turn things over. The French customs are beastly. They aren't so keen on works of art as the Italians, but they'd be down on us for not declaring them. See? As for going straight home without touching anywhere, I can't. Even if we fill up with water here, it's not enough for the run home. We may be held up in the bay by bad weather. One never knows." "When do you propose to start off?" asked Bobby. "When we've done with the last of these houses and fished up that Victory thing in the street," replied Sam. "That'll give us a fuller cargo than we want." It was in the last house, 4 days later, that they brought up the crown of the expedition, a marble Aphrodite, small like all the statuary of Hyalos, not more than 4 feet from crown to base, but exquisite as a dream. The hands were folded on the breast, recalling the attitude of Botticelli's Venus rising from the sea. Unlike the Venus of Milo, she was entire, without loss of a finger of her perfect hands or a toe of the feet that rested on a plinth, suggestive of a breaking wave. The after cabin, which was Marcia's, had 2 bunks, an upper and a lower. The Aphrodite was placed in the lower, fastened securely with lashings, and covered with a bunk coverlet. "Tomorrow," said Sam, "we'll pick up those Victory fragments in the street, and the day after, if this wind holds, we'll put out for home." But things were not to be as easy as that. Chapter 21. The Ship. People boxed up together in a small boat like the Lorna react on one another in a most surprising way. Bad temper or good humor in an individual is felt by his companions as it never would be ashore. On board the Lorna that night, down in the cabin under the swinging lamp, Sam was the wet blanket. He sat with his nose in a book while the other two talked. He did not seem to be reading so much as brooding. Bobby had given up the whole problem of Sam and Marcia, and Sam's fits of depression, and so on. The girl had as good as told him that there was nothing between her and the skipper, and he left it at that. The expedition up to this had put everything else aside, love included, and would do so till the English coast was reached and the contract with Behrens completed. All the same, this brooding fit that had fallen on Samuel Hackett, now that work had relaxed, worried Bobby. The only comfort to him was that there was no town ashore, no bars to which the depressed one could fly for relief in the shape of alcohol. There was whiskey on board the Lorna, but the presence of Marcia was a restraining influence strong enough to prevent any outburst. The fates who try to spoil plans and wreck expeditions had, however, taken note of this last fact, as the sequel was to prove. The ship's company retired early that night and were on deck next morning an hour after sunrise. The engine having been set going, the ship was manoeuvred over the selected spot and the anchor dropped. The depths were not yet fully lighted, owing to the lowness of the sun, yet they could see glimmering up to them through the water the shattered group, the little wheel of the chariot, the horse's head, the figure of Victory growing momentarily more defined in the strengthening light. Glastonbury, a cigarette in his mouth, was getting ready to don the diver's dress, and Sam was assisting Church to rig the tackle necessary for the work, when Bowler, who had been looking seaward, suddenly left the deck and swarmed up to the crosstrees. He clung there for a moment in silence. Then his voice came. "Below there! Ship to the northwest, coming up this way." Then he came down with a run, and Sam, leaving the tackle to look after itself and taking the glass from its sling, went up. Glastonbury ceased dressing and lit another cigarette, whilst the others stood, faces up-tilted, watching Sam. Yes, away on the distance of that miraculous sea, blue as sapphire and lit by morning, a stain of smoke showed, and beneath the smoke an object that the glass resolved into a vessel of small tonnage travelling fast and making dead for higher loss. It was the smoke stain that had attracted the bird-keen eyes of Bowler from the deck, and without a glass he had been able to see the truth. Sam came down with a run. "This does us," said he. "I don't know what she is. Too quick and small for a freighter. Not a warship by any English standard, but these confounded foreign navies have all sorts of bumboats in their service. Whatever she is, she's coming here, and there's sure to be trouble. Cuss and confound her. We've got to camouflage. Man the winch and get the anchor in. Church, nip down and get the engine ready. Glastonbury, get all that truck of yours into the forecastle. We'll bring her west of this place and drop the hook closer inshore. We're an English yacht put in the day before yesterday." The others said not a word. The clanking of the winch pals filled the air, the anchor was brought home, and the Lorna, under the auxiliary and steered by Sam, turned and stole off across the agora, across the submerged theatre, across the tranquil bay, dropping anchor 3 cable lengths from the shore. Here the wily Sam, after another observation from the cross-trees that confirmed his worst suspicions, ordered the boat to be got over. "What do you want with the boat?" asked Bobby. "You'll see in a minute," replied the other. They had brought a small tent for possible camping out. It was stowed down below. He had it brought up and got into the boat that was now alongside. Then he ordered Church and Atherfield to take it ashore, set it up, and come back. "We've been exploring the island and fishing," he explained to the others. "The tent will help the story out. Now there's nothing more to do but trust in Providence and have breakfast." They went below, where Marcia had laid out the things and made the coffee. There had been no time to cook anything, so they had to content themselves with canned stuff and biscuits. During the meal, Bowler from time to time kept them informed, through the skylight, as to the doings of the stranger. "You can see her from the deck now, sir. She's easing down. A boat pulling off, sir, for the reefs." From time to time, Sam or one of the others popped up on deck. The thing was painted grey, with a yellow smokestack and a white deck house. She looked as though she might be some foreigner's idea of a yacht. No Englishman would have been seen dead on board her at Cowes. The stovepipe funnel, the sheer stern, and the size of the deck house were enough in themselves. And, to complete the picture, the paint on the hull had gone rusty. "She's a howling ambulance," said Sam. "She's no Navy boat, unless the Digger Indians have started a fleet. And she hasn't been here before, else she wouldn't be sending that boat to take soundings of the channel. Look at that chocolate box of a deck house, and the rake of those masts, and the size of that jackstaff." A siren that might have belonged to the Majestic suddenly let off, answered by a bellow from the astonished echoes of the island, and they saw that the stranger was moving again, following the boat through the channel. The boat of the Lorna had returned from pitching the tent, and Sam, getting into her, prepared to put off and board the newcomer. "I'll go and see them," said he. "It's better than them coming to see us. You can bet I'll do all I can to make them keep their distance and fool them." He put off, Bowler and Church rowing, just as the stranger, passing the reefs, breasted the waters of the bay, going dead slow, a fellow in the chains swinging the lead and calling out the fathoms in a voice that came sharp as the cry of a gull. "That's a foreigner," said Bobby, as he stood watching with Marcia. "There's one thing certain, she doesn't know this place, or she wouldn't be stealing in like that. At least, she doesn't know the passage and the soundings. There goes the anchor." The rumble of the chain, following the splash, came across the water, and then they stood watching the Lorna's boat closing with the newcomer, Sam at the yoke line steering to fetch her on the starboard side. They saw the ladder thrown down and the redoubtable Sam climbing on deck. "He's talking to a tall, black-bearded chap in a white yachting cap," said Bobby, who had the glass. "He's pointing towards us, and they're jabbering together. Now they've gone into the deck house." He handed the glass to the girl, and she put it to her eye. "Oh, I can see it quite close," cried she, as though the fact were a phenomenon. "Look at the little men on deck. They're all on this side looking at us. And there's a man throwing a bucket of water overboard. There's a man all in white with a white cap. He must be the cook. I can see a name on the bow." "Can you read it?" "Now I can, almost, and now I can't. It goes and comes. It's the movement of the ship. It's a double name. Santa. Santa. Oh, that's it. Santa Margherita. It's the name of a place near Genoa. I've heard it before." She handed the glass back to him, and they continued to watch the stranger, alongside which Bowler and Church in the Lorna's boat were seated, smoking and making no attempt to fraternize with the fellows on board. Nearly half an hour passed, and then Sam, followed by the black-bearded man, appeared on deck, dropped into the boat, and pushed off. "It's all okay," said the skipper of the Lorna as he came over the side. "It's a chap that fancies he's doing a yachting trip in that bathtub. Visconti is his name. Italian, and they've put in here to do a repair." "How long will they be over it?" asked Bobby. "Oh, says he'll be off tomorrow, and he's asked me to drop over and have dinner with him tonight." "Didn't he ask us to?" "No," said Sam. "I told him the Lorna was my boat, and I was down here for my health and the fishing, and we went on yarning, without my mentioning you two, and suddenly he sprung the dinner proposition on me. It was too late then. I couldn't say I have two friends on board. It would have looked as if I were fishing for an invitation for you." "I don't think it would," said Marcia. "And if it did, why shouldn't you fish for an invitation?" She was disappointed. A break in the monotony of the life on board would have been welcome. So would a change of food and the opportunity to put on an evening frock. She could have smacked Sam for his stupidity, but Sam had sense on his side as well as diffidence. "You see, it's not only that," he explained. "It's the bother of getting too friendly with him, and his staying on here and messing about. If we all went to dinner with him, we'd have to ask him back. He'd be sure anyhow to call before leaving. Whereas, if I just nip over alone, the thing is ended and done with." "Are you sure he's all right?" asked the girl. I mean that he's not anyone connected with the Greek government or anyone come to spy on us." "He's quite all right," said Sam. "He's a gentleman, and he's cruising for his health." "Oh, dear," said she. "What's the matter?" "Nothing. Only that doesn't sound, somehow, as if it was all right. Was it on account of his health that he came exactly here? Didn't it seem funny, when you were talking to him, to think that you both had come here for your health, at least that you were both yachting for your health?" "No," said Sam. "Why should it? These seas, at least the Mediterranean and Aegean, are pretty much health resorts. If two people met in Buxton, say, and told each other they had come there for their gout, would it be funny?" "I'm not talking of Buxton. I only say the whole thing seems to me fishy. Does he call that thing he's in a yacht?" "Yes. He hired her for 3 months. He's got no illusions about her. Couldn't. She's awful, and the deck house is a cockroach trap. But he says she's good enough to see sunsets from, and the open deck is his chief home on board of her." "Italian?" asked Marcia. "Yes, he's Italian." "Visconti," said Bobby, who seemed plunged in meditation. "Where have I heard that name before? Visconti. Visconti." "Genoa, maybe," said Sam. "No, it wasn't in Genoa. It was before that, and it seems to me it was in connection with the expedition. It wasn't at Poole or at the stores. Somewhere or another I heard it, but I can't remember where." "Well," said Marcia, "there's no use in bothering if you can't. Maybe I'm hypersensitive and quite wrong, but I feel somehow as if danger had suddenly sprung up against us, as though we ought to beware of the man and his boat. Anyhow," said she, speaking to Sam, "if you go to dinner tonight, be careful of what you say. Don't let him trap you into telling anything. I know, I didn't mean to suggest you do anything foolish. I only meant to warn you." "Thanks," said Sam, evidently huffed. "I'm not a child, whatever else I may be. And as for Visconti, he showed no sign at all of trying to pump me, or of having any idea at all about this place, except that it was a good harbor for a small boat to put into." Marcia said nothing more and went below. She had a lot of work to do. Hers from the start had been the business of keeping things tidy below deck. During the treasure hunt, nobody had much time for anything but the great business in hand. As a consequence, things were all over the place and confusion everywhere. Clothes and all sorts of gear had been ejected from lockers to give place to the vases wrapped in straw, and small objects of statuary and things that ought to have been in the lazarette were finding refuge on the cabin floor. She set to on these matters, but the work did not stop her from thinking, and the more she thought, the more she disliked the idea of Sam going off to dine alone with this gentleman who was cruising for his health. But there was no use in worrying, and the hard work of putting things straight soothed her mind. The stranger could know nothing of the work they had been doing, even if he knew of the existence of Hyalos. Their story was plausible, and the appearance of the tent ashore bore it out. All the same, her mind, though quietened, was not quite satisfied. At 7 o'clock, Sam, in his best coat and looking a bit more respectable than usual, was rowed off to the Santa Margarita through a blue, luminous twilight, above which the constellations were sketching themselves, and through which the voice of the reefs came ghostly, mixed with the occasional weak cry of a gull. Bobby and the girl watched him go, and then went down to their own dinner, canned corned beef and potatoes boiled by Church, with canned asparagus to follow. The beef they had brought in the harness cask had suddenly become tainted, and they had been living for a week, mostly on canned stuff, helped out with fish when they had time to do any fishing. Anyone who has been condemned to live on canned food for any time will know how it palls. The fact that Sam was possibly enjoying a good dinner served by a French cook did not improve the flavor of the food before them, and Marcia said so. "The only comfort is," said Bobby, "that Sam doesn't know good from bad and can't be enjoying it." He was sitting opposite to her, and it seemed to him that whatever else might be the outcome of the voyage, it had been up to this the remaking of the girl before him. The tired look had gone from her eyes, and the colour that London had driven away had come back to her cheeks. Marcia was good to look upon as she sat there, the lamplight falling on her shapely little head. Good to look at, despite the fact that her get-up would have destroyed the attraction of any continental woman, consisting as it did of a coat and skirt, the worse for sea wear and salt. Bobby, alone with her for the first time in weeks, had to crush down the desire of his heart and leave unspoken the words rising to his lips. There was still much to be done ere he could treat her other than as a shipmate and fellow worker and say to her what he wanted to say. He got pretty near it, though. Even if he was, he went on, he'd deserve it, for he's been working like a nigger this last month. We all have, said she. Yes, we all have, and we deserve what we've got. What do you think is the worth of the stuff we've hived already? Marcia knitted her brows in thought. I don't know, said she. Anything over £100,000, I should think. 100,000? Why not? Some of these things are priceless, far, far above the rubies, for rubies are always being found. That Aphrodite alone might bring a little fortune. It all depends on finding a buyer. That's where Behrens comes in. He as good as told me that these things would go to America. If I tell you something, said Marcia, you won't speak of it to anyone else? Never. Well, I believe Mr. Behrens has arranged that everything we find shall go to South America. Argentina. The wealth of Argentina is simply fabulous, and things can be sold there without too much bother as to where they came from. I'm telling you this in confidence, though he did not make me promise to keep it to myself. I shan't say a word, said Bobby, but I'm glad to know. It makes things all the surer, and it seems to me there's almost certainly a big profit coming from this business, and that's what worries me. How? This way. I'm to get half, according to my contract with Behrens. That is to say, half after all expenses are deducted. Yes? Well, where do you come in? You've worked as hard as any of us. Me? Why, I've had this trip for nothing. I don't want anything more. He did not reply for a moment. He could not say what was in his mind, that whatever money he made was hers as well as his. We'll talk about that later on, he said at last. There's no use in counting our chickens before they are hatched, and we haven't got the stuff home yet. But there's another point. Sam. I doubt if he'll take anything, replied she. First of all, he's one of those queer people who don't care a button for money, and secondly, he looks on all this not as work, but as fun. But he's worked a lot harder than I have. Yes, but what you call work isn't work to him. He's never happier than when he's in his shirt sleeves rigging tackles and overhauling spars. He'd be absolutely and perfectly content if he could only repaint the Lorna on top of everything else. He was grumbling to me only yesterday because there was no paint on board. Bobby said no more. It was on the tip of his tongue to ask her right out what she had known about Sam in the past, and exactly what their relationship had been, but he restrained himself. Presently they went on deck, Marcia retiring to her cabin about an hour later. It was now 10 o'clock, and as he sat smoking he could see the forms of the men who had gathered forward round the forecastle hatch, and away across the moonlit bay the lights of the Santa Margarita. It was a far cry from Cadogan Street and Piccadilly Circus, and the remembrance of London brought up before him the fact that his life in the course of a very few weeks had taken a new direction, and his future a new significance. If what Marcia said was true, and he felt that it was true, he was no longer a man scraping about to make a living at story writing, but a man of means, maybe of wealth. £20,000 would be a fortune, and the profit of this wonderful haul from the sea might even bring him in much more than that. The expedition was a success. It was only just in this minute of relaxation that he recognized the full fact and the real meaning of it, and the truth that in a few weeks he had made what many a man labors a lifetime to make. Had made? Ah, there was the rub. The thing was not ended yet. They had still to face the sea's pleasure and the chance of storms. They had still to face mischance. Everything up to this had been easy. Too easy, almost. Of fortune, one true thing can be said, that she has two faces, one beautiful as heaven, one hideous as hell. Thinking like this, his eyes fell on the lights of the Santa Margarita, and a sudden vague uneasiness seized him. What did that hooker want, putting in just now? There was no reason why she should not have put in to do a repair. Still, it was a nuisance. A day or two more, and they would have been gone, and no one would ever have known that they had been to Hyalos. But there was no use in bothering. The Santa Margarita, whatever she was, had evidently never been here before, else she would have come in without sending a boat before her to take soundings. Hyalos was evidently as strange to her as it had been to them. Stranger, for they had been able to come in without any bother. If the people on board her knew nothing about the place, it was almost a sure thing that they knew nothing of the treasure city. Still, he wished Sam was back. It was now 11:15. He went forward and had a word with the fellows by the forecastle hatch. Then he paced the deck. The idea came to him to send a boat off for Sam, but the arrangement had been that the Santa Margarita people would send the skipper back, and Bobby put the idea away. Time passed. The fellows on deck dropped below, leaving only Atherfield as anchor watch. The moon dropped further to the west. Then, at last, away over the water, something showed. It was a boat, and at the same moment, like the windows of a house shutting up after some festivity, the deckhouse lights of the Santa Margarita went out. The boat came alongside to port. Bobby dropped the ladder. The skipper of the Lorna came on board, leg over rail, and the boat started back. Sam was breathing hard, with his lips closed. He was not quite steady on his pins. He took Bobby by the shoulder and drew his head close. "Is she in bed?" whispered Sam. "Yes, that's all right," said the other. "What have you been doing?" "Glorious time," whispered the festive one. "Awful good chap, that chap. Help us down. Don't make a noise." When he was in his bunk, he refused to undress. Bobby sat for a moment contemplating things. Then a movement from the bunk drew his attention. Sam, with his hair horribly and suddenly tousled, was motioning him to come close. "Don't tell her I got like this," whispered the reveller. "It's not what I've had has done me, but the worry of life. If you'd ruined your life in the past, same's I've ruined mine, you'd know. You'd know." "Oh, shut up and go to sleep," replied Bobby. Chapter 22. The Dumping of the Victory. Lying awake that night, Bobby remembered again his first interview with Marcia and her talk about the predilection of editors and the public for stories with a feminine interest. He began to wonder, as he lay listening to the heavy breathing of the skipper, whether there ever existed a story, in real life or fiction, since the story of Adam, without some woman somewhere or somewhen having a finger in it. If he had set out to choose on sight, for this expedition, a skipper absolutely foolproof against females, he would have chosen Sam. Yet look, how could he have known that Sam had a mysterious female somewhere in the background of his life? A love tragedy, the remembrance of which tended now and then to make him fly off the handle. He couldn't. Sam had been foisted on him as sound goods by the god of expeditions, who sends ships to sea with rotten garboard strakes, who puts weevils in biscuits and leaks in water tanks, the god who loves to watch strong men fighting against adversity. Had Sam talked on board the Santa Margarita? Had he by any chance said a word too much? Bobby was quite sure that Samuel, in no circumstances whatever, would have told of their doings at Hyalos. All the same, he might by accident have done just as bad, letting fall a chance word that would arouse suspicion. Well, if he had, the thing was done, and there was no use in bothering about it. Time would tell. Leaving it at that, Bobby turned on his side and fell asleep. Coming on deck next morning, he found the festive one dressed and in his right mind, without a trace of his doings upon him. He was talking to Marcia, telling her what a pleasant time he had spent the night before, the tonnage of the Santa Margarita, the fact that Visconti was a really good sort, a Neapolitan gentleman whose ancestry went back to the time of Virgil, that the Santa Margarita had damaged a cylinder cover, which had been put right, and that she was off that morning back to Naples. Bobby said nothing. He was content to let the matter rest at that, and trust in the providence that had protected them up to this. After breakfast, when they came up on deck, the anchor winch of the Santa Margarita was rousing the shore echoes. Bowler got the flag ready and ran it up and dipped it as the stranger, turning in a big curve, made for the reef opening, her siren letting off in salute of the Lorna and her ugly stern showing as she cleared off down the channel. In 10 minutes she was a smoke wreath on the far sea, a memory. "Now fetch back that tent," said Sam, "and we'll go and scrape up that mess in the street." The mess in the street, brought on board by 8 bells, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, included the Victory, her broken wing, the little chariot wheel, and the horse's head. There were other fragments, but they were left. As it was, to use Sam's expression, they had bitten off more than they could chew. The Victory was impossible to stow. The only place for her was the forecastle, and the forecastle was overcrowded. Besides, the hatch was too narrow to get her down. It was the wing that did the mischief. Sam proposed to break it off, but they could not do it. They could not break and brutally treat that living marble. Time and disaster had done enough to it. So they dumped her, and she was worth heaven only knows what. The funeral took place after dinner, in the dark, just before the moon had time to lighten the depths of the bay. Getting into the boat, which was alongside, they released her from the lowering tackle and let her slip into the darkness of the water, through which a long stream of phosphorescent bubbles rose, dissolved, and vanished. "And that's the end of the job," said Sam, little knowing how far from them the end of the job was yet. Next morning they filled the water tanks early and devoted the forenoon to exploring the parts of the city they had missed. Actually, notwithstanding all the time they had been there, they knew little of the place beyond the theatre, the agora, and the Street of Victory. Time being the essence of their contract, they could not waste it. Never for a day or for a moment had they been quite free of the vague dread that someone might turn up to see what they were doing. Some Greek naval boat, or even some fishermen from Milo or Polycandro, away to the north. Today they could breathe freely and look about them. It was their last day there, Sam having determined to weigh anchor next morning, and the last time, in all probability, that any one of them would see the place. They rowed across the theatre, and leaving the agora struck over the street to the right, named by Isaac Behrens the Street of Hermes. It seemed to them narrower than the Street of Victory, and the houses poorer. As for the Street of the Winds, opening on the east of the agora, it was narrower still. There was no statuary, either standing or fallen, in these streets as in the Street of Victory, yet in the Street of the Winds they came on something more fascinating than any piece of sculpture. The water was shallow here, only a couple of feet above the rooftops, and down below, at a depth of only 5 fathoms, lay a slab of stone with something written on it in Greek characters. Sam declaring that he would dive for it, as the water was shallow, they put back to the ship and got some signal halyard line. Armed with this, he went down as he was and brought it up. It was a slab of marble about a foot by 18 inches, and scratched roughly but fairly deep there appeared these characters. Tomelima, Tumon. "What's the meaning of it?" asked the girl. Bobby's classical education was enough to allow him to decipher the thing. "It's a graph," said he, "same as you find on the walls of Pompeii, only those are in Latin. Some fellow in love with some girl must have scratched it on the front of her house, which was probably faced with marble slabs. It means my darling." He was probably right as to the origin of the thing, but he did not know that it was a tag taken from Sappho, and possibly had some extra meaning owing to the context of the lost poem to which it belonged. Marcia touched the words with her finger, and a far-away look came into her eyes. Possibly she was thinking of the lover who had written that beneath the window of the girl he loved, on the wall of her house, or maybe on the wall of some public place, just to give relief to his heart. Some lover whose very bones had vanished from the world, but whose voice still spoke in the language of the human heart, which is older than Greek. Bobby watched her. He would have given a good deal to have known her thoughts. She had cared for Isaac Behrens. Was it possible that she was thinking of him? The vague, absurd jealousy he had felt when Behrens had told him that she had been engaged to Isaac came back. He had forgotten it, almost, but Hyalos was Isaac's find, and this love message, was she possibly connecting it with Isaac's memory? He wished that Sam had let the thing lie. They rowed back to the ship, Marcia holding the little tablet on her knee. Once on board, she took it to her cabin as though she looked upon it as her own property. Bobby could have kicked Sam.